Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 29th of January 2024. Let's get to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find the caveats in the description to the video below. And we have some incredibly high numbers again for a number of these categories, particularly personnel. Over 1,000, 1,070. That would have been record number maybe a year ago. Now our ranges have shifted as we have had 1,380 personnel lost in the last few months. Russians, so 1,070 though, still a really high number. 10 tanks, 25 APVs, that's fairly significant in that category for sure. 10 tanks is also not anything to sniff at, and 16 artillery systems is going to be a bit of a challenge. Not the highest number in that category, but still pretty challenging. And then we have 46 vehicles and fuel tanks. That's a very high number for Russian logistics, and that's going to be hurt somewhat, and 7 pieces of special equipment. So that's some fairly challenging numbers there. Obviously, quite a bit of activity on the front lines yesterday, although you never quite know with Monday whether there's numbers in the Sunday figures that are picking up from Saturday and whatever. It can be a bit variable, but that is sort of day that the Ukrainians will find very useful. When we look to Andrew Perpetua's loss list, actually we have something that's not quite parity, but approaching it, sort of 1.5, maybe just over 1 times the ratio of rates of Russian to Ukrainian losses, and that's obviously not ideal for the Ukrainians. They need sort of 3 to 1 at least, ideally something like 5 to 1. I mean, the higher the better. So that is definitely not the best day as far as Andrew's stats are concerned. Let's look at the value difference between the two. So for the Ukrainians, a couple of boats, surveillance and comms equipment, an old artillery system, some T-64 BVs. Talked about them not necessarily being super old, depends on the variant. We do have a Stridsvagn 122 that's abandoned. That's a Leopard 2A5 tank of Swedish origin. So that's going to be a high value loss. A couple of BMPs, M113, APC, and some SUVs and whatnot. So yeah, I guess a Stridsvagn 122 will be fairly high value. Okay, let's look at the Russian losses. Command and control truck is going to be a high value bit of kit to have been destroyed. You can see as well that actually when it comes to the Ukrainian losses, some of these are damaged, some are abandoned. There's actually a very high proportion of destroyed equipment for the Russians in tanks and IFVs, APCs particularly. So that is worth noting. Command truck, as mentioned, would be fairly high value. A range of tanks there, some BMP 3s and 2s mainly, with one BMP 1 at the end. A Tiger APC damaged, and pyramid dispenser. The Dragon's Teeth dispenser there. So a number of bits of other equipment, civilian and military trucks and whatnot. So I think, yeah, the Ukrainians will probably be annoyed at losing that Stridsvagn 122 or having that abandoned. Don't know whether it's recoverable. Generally, the Russians have lost more. Yeah. Okay, now as far as the value is concerned, this is from yesterday. This is not today's figures, but the totals are in red beneath. So this is the value of each equipment category over the course of the war, and you can just see how much this war costing the Russians on a daily basis. To lose that many pieces of equipment is just absolutely phenomenal, with just huge amounts of valuable equipment loss. So you can pause that and check out the stats. So dire. Right. We're now going to go on to a little bit of a section of Russian disinformation. This is quite important so that you understand why I report how I do, and also to understand that the Russians are just full of hot air on a regular basis. Andrew Perpetua reacting to some claim that has come out of a Russian source saying, and the way I understand this is basically it looks like a civilian, an elderly civilian, was hit by a drone. And the Russians have come out and blamed the Ukrainians for killing their own old person with a drone in Kherson area, I believe, somewhere around there, Berislav. And Andrew Perpetua saying this is 100% BS. we have video of Russian drones literally chasing down and dropping bombs on civilians in Berislav. So they come up with the story that the Ukrainian army were living next door, had an argument with this old person. Apparently, the old person was complaining they're making too much noise. I mean, goodness me. And then so they chased him down with a drone and killed him. And the Russians have said, we phoned the family and confirmed this. And Andrew Perch is like, yeah, that didn't happen. We had, and the evidence he has is the form of the Russians, because the Russians at the end then say, we have much more attractive targets to hit nearby. Why we bother doing that? And Andrew says, we've got so much evidence of you doing exactly that, just tons of it. And he's talked about this before. Actually, he got pretty down on one of his live streams recently, or angry about how the Russians do this on such a regular occasion. He talks about how they blow up civilian cars. Now, not civilian cars are being used for military purposes. They literally target civilian cars with civilians, or civilian cars outside civilian homes, right along the Dnipro River bank, the right bank there. So anyway, he says, we have video of Russian drones literally chasing down and dropping bombs on civilians in Berislav. We've been geolocating and mapping those drones these drone attacks on Berislav very regularly, proudly posted by the Russians. So the Russians post them and say, look what we've done, killing civilians. So, you know, they've done it, they've admitted it, and Andrew Perpetua has got the evidence of this. But then when they occasionally come out and deny it and blame it on the Ukrainians, you're like, nah. But now they deny their terrorism. And so he goes through a number of examples here, which I think is really useful. Here's an example of Russians attacking civilians with drone drop bombs in Berislav, posted October 30th. You can see in prior post watching civilians walk around right before their attack, and then them stalking police officers, and then attacking civilian cars, and then they've critically wounded and killed police officers and other civilians in these attacks, and he gives the evidence there. More drone attacks on civilians, and he gives some more evidence of that happening. And yeah, so okay, let's not believe the Russians when they make those kinds of claims. What else can we look at? Well, here there are some claims that the new Skynex system, which is that brand new, I guess, replacement of something like a Gepard. So it's a palletized system that you can put on the back of a truck, or you can pop it down on the ground, and it just fires massive amounts of lead into the air. It's kind of semi-autonomous. It can be controlled, but can also be to do stuff automatically. And they got two of these now, or they have one and another one's on the way. Or anyway, different claims. The Russians are claiming to have blown one up, and you could be forgiven for thinking they have done. I mean, here we look at it and okay, that's a truck that looks fairly similar to that truck, okay, and it's got something on the back that looks a bit funky. The Germinator Ukraine has done quite a bit of research on this. Allegedly, this is one of the 4 Skynex shooters, which are part of the Skynex air defense system financed by Germany for Ukraine. I don't know if they definitely got all 4 destroyed, even if I have to admit that it looks similar and I can't explain what is being loaded or pulled at the rear. It should be noted that all Skynex components were mounted on new HX 8x8 trucks worth 12 million euros, not an old MAN Cat 1 like the one you see in the image. In other words, they aren't mounted on a truck, so highly unlikely it's that. I also spoke to War Vehicle and another OSINT chap, a German OSINT chap, to get their opinions, and we all agree this is not a Skynex shooter, even if it looks somewhat similar to the back of the vehicle. Thanks to both of them, especially to War Vehicle, who invested half an hour with me on this one. The metal of the revolver gun Mark III would also have been quite bent. You can see especially at the integrated sensor unit, tracking radar, laser finder, rangefinder, IR camera, TV camera, which I have framed in blue. So yeah, there is very low probability that that is a Skynex that the Russians are claiming. Then we come on to another scenario of Russians talking BS. This is Perun's latest video, which is, as ever, excellent. We're going to have a little section on the losses around Avdiivka for the Russians, and them being stupendous losses. And then we're going to look at their lost armor, which is the Russian version of Oryx, where they compiled data. And Perun looked at stats for one particular part of that data to see, hang on, we've got a difference from what the Ukrainians are claiming and a difference from what the Russians are claiming. There's a difference between 21 and 51. What explains this extra 30 the Russian claims have been destroyed by the Ukrainians, right? And then he looks at the Russian data and finds it massively problematic. So let's look at this.
As best as we can tell, visually confirmed armoured vehicle destruction and abandonment rates around Avdiivka have been some of the most shockingly one-sided of the war. The Ukrainians have, of course, lost some particularly valuable pieces of equipment, but as at time of recording, the Russians have burned through more than 150 main battle tanks and are pushing towards 300 armoured fighting vehicles. And that's after I removed all damaged targets from this data set because I often consider the category too ambiguous.
So this is really bad. Like, the Russian losses in Avdiivka since October have been insane, and they are visually confirmed insane, and that insanity does not include damage. That is just the absolutely bona fide destroyed bits of kit. But the lost stats will be far higher than what he is explaining here.
Put that into perspective, if you were to take every American Bradley and Swedish CV-90 the Ukrainians are believed to have received so far during this entire war, it would not be enough to cover Russia's visually confirmed AFE losses just since October, just around Avdiivka. The situation in the Krynki zone has been broadly similar, but much more polarized by category. Here, Russian and Ukrainian artillery losses, excluding MLRS systems, are much closer together, with many of those Ukrainian losses being as a result of Lancet strikes or the use of glide bombs. But given that Ukraine hasn't been able to push armoured vehicles across the river, while Russia has thrown several armoured assaults against the Ukrainian bridgehead, the battle has given us some of the most shockingly uneven MBT and AFE loss ratios of the entire war.
So this is so important to understand because this is why Ukraine are still fighting on the bridgehead in Krynki. This is what I've been talking about for days and days and weeks and weeks and weeks. Like, they are there, and it's a pretty thankless task if you're one of the people that is sent to that bridgehead to fight and probably die or get injured. It is horrific for the Ukrainians there. However, and this is why some of them say it's a suicide task. We don't know why we're doing it. The reason they are doing it is because that enables them to attract. They are the bait, unfortunately, but from a military tactical point of view that doesn't concern itself with the emotions of this, is a really important method of attracting the Russians to the area, fixing them there, and then attriting them at alarmingly good rates for the Ukrainians. This is then justified by the verified, confirmed losses that you're seeing here. Now, what's interesting is he says towed artillery and SPGs are actually, the Ukrainians have lost a fair number in the area, or at least, numbers that are closer to the Russian losses. But actually, MLRS, the Russians have lost a lot of MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems here compared to the Ukrainians. But then when you start getting to the armored fighting vehicles, your infantry fighting vehicles, your APCs, that, and your tanks, the Russians have lost stupendous amounts. Anti-air as well is fairly problematic.
For tanks, 1 to 18. For armoured fighting vehicles, 1 to 51. And in some categories,
1 to 50, that's a ratio of 1 to 51. They are losing, the Russians, 51 times more AFVs than the Ukrainians. That is insane. Like 18 times as many tanks. And that's basically because the Ukrainians don't have the mechanized equipment in the area. Or if they do have it, they're not bringing it close to the river because otherwise it just gets targeted and it can't be effective. But they can't use that to destroy Russian equipment because the Russian equipment is over the other side of the river, and the Ukrainians can't get their equipment from the right bank to the left bank, and so they keep it far away, so the drones can't attack them and attrit them. However, the Russians are bringing equipment in to try and dislodge the Ukrainian bridgehead, and in so doing are getting absolutely hammered.
Categories a healthy divide by zero error. Now, of course, even though a lot of work goes into these visually confirmed loss databases, and often they're some of the best available information that we have, I always like to test that sort of data against Russian sources where it's practical to do so. In the case of Krynki, we do actually have something that might serve for a sort of apples-to-apples comparison. Lost Armor is a Russian website publishing claimed Ukrainian losses, and they have a list of claimed Ukrainian artillery losses supporting the bridgehead at Krynki, complete with claimed visual evidence. Now, at first, it seems like there's a great clash between this data and the data I just showed you. The first set had 10 Ukrainian artillery losses, the Lost Armour database has 51. Part of that disparity can probably be solved straight away. The Lost Armour database includes both damaged and destroyed equipment, whereas that 10 from before was just destroyed equipment. Revise it up to damaged as well, and we instead have 21 versus 51. Closer, but still very much not in agreement. My second thought was because there's no universal set of rules on how you should classify a particular set of losses, it might be that the Lost Armour set was overclaiming in some way, or at least including material that wouldn't be included according to the evidentiary standards of the first set. So, both because accuracy matters, and because who wouldn't want to spend a chunk of their afternoon auditing drone footage, I ran through a sample of the list, starting top to bottom, something you can also do if you're so inclined, and yeah, there were a couple of things that stood out. Firstly,
in other words, the Russian list is ostensibly inaccurate, right? And he then goes through the reasons why it's inaccurate, and we're going to listen to this. But just when you ask me, or when Kremlin Voices ask me, well, why don't you produce stats for the Ukrainian losses? It's because, and he actually talks about it in this video, but we won't go through that bit. When you look at what the TASS says, so the state media outlet for the Russians, of the Ukrainian losses, some of those categories are physically impossible. They're up to over 500, I think, airframes now, which is like over double what the Ukrainians started the war with. It's physically impossible. So I don't tell you what they say, because it's just nonsense, utter nonsense. But then when we look at, say, Lost Armour, the Oryx equivalent that Russia has, and try and work out whether their stats are accurate, they are found woefully inadequate.
Duplicate footage. With this video of a Lancet strike, for example, being marked both against a 2S1 entry at one set of coordinates and an M109 entry at another set. This video is used both for a Lancet strike on an unknown self-propelled gun, which is what it appears to be labelled as, but is also included 2 entries later as evidence for a glide bomb strike against a Zuzana 2, which is interesting because I would have expected more visual difference in blast effect between a 3 to 5 kilo warhead and a 500 plus kilogram bomb. Now, to be fair here, it's entirely possible that this is just an uploading error, that there is an accurate video somewhere and it just hasn't been uploaded and listed correctly. But hopefully you understand when I say I don't think I can count a loss as evidenced, if the evidence basically amounts to, trust me bro, I promise I have the video, I just left it at home. If at any point these listings are amended, I'll be happy to take another look. But in calling out the duplicates thing, I've sort of skipped over one of the other more common issues. And because I've shown off a couple of examples from the first 10, I'll jump to the sample of the final 5 that I looked at. And that's the fact that, at least to my viewing, a lot of these videos seem very, very inconclusive and wouldn't, or at least shouldn't, make it into a database like this. Make no mistake, on this list, there are some very clear, very crisp entries that clearly show what they claim to show. But there are also heaps of cases, particularly when it comes to glide bombing attacks, where seriously I have seen more convincing footage of Bigfoot. To avoid any accusations of cherry picking, these are literally the first 2 entries I looked at the bottom of the list, and in one case that blue circle is original, in the second I've added my own just for clarity, because clearly and unambiguously what you're looking at here, just in case you couldn't figure it out, is the destruction of a self-propelled gun in the top image, and the destruction of another artillery target on the bottom. A cynic might suggest that given Russian glide bombs are not the most accurate systems on the planet, that one editing technique might simply be to take a video, circle an area where you know the bomb is going to land, show the bomb landing where you circled, and declare victory. Because anyone on the planet can be a perfectly accurate marksman if you get to call your shot after you've already made it. Now, obviously, it is possible that in amongst those blobs and smudges, there is a target that is being destroyed. But
reminds me of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
If you're going to set a standard for what counts as visual confirmation, if a Ukrainian source submitted a close-up like this one, I'd hope that in the absence of other evidence it would be classified as inconclusive and we'd all move on. Which brings us to the next entry and another war footage favourite, this being the ambiguous edit or time skip. This video includes some good footage of what appears to be a Ukrainian armoured vehicle entering the right-hand side of this building. Then you get a cut forward to video of a bomb appearing to impact the left-hand side of the building, and a second strike that appears to potentially miss entirely and land out front. That's probably enough evidence to conclude that the building was struck, but different databases are going to apply different standards on whether or not it's proof that a vehicle was inside and destroyed or damaged. I could go on, but the goal here is not to beat down on any particular source, but rather to make a broader point. Different sources don't just have different levels of credibility, they also apply different standards. And often those sources might go some way towards explaining how different sources came to very different conclusions. For example, I would probably classify what is claimed to be a Lancet missing an armoured vehicle by several metres to be a miss, but according to the standards applied here, it's being included as a claimed loss. Because armoured vehicles are famously incapable of surviving the shrapnel that might be thrown up by a small loitering munition warhead landing several metres away. Ultimately, looking at lost data, we need to have a degree of comfort with the uncertainty involved. But at least in this case, having had an opportunity to look at some potentially contradictory information, I'm generally pretty happy continuing to use the war spotting and Oryx data as a sort of floor. And so with that caveat in place, what's the equipment loss picture look like when you bring together some of the major engagements of 2023 and early 2024? For Ukraine, the equipment loss rate...
And he goes on to do an analysis of the loss rates, which is obviously worth watching. Just you piece these data points together. What I've just shown you, about Russian lying, certain claims, and even on I think on that for lost armor list, they still have HIMARS losses that have been debunked. I've debunked 2 HIMARS loss videos, right, and I think they've got them on there. They are not credible. So when pro-Kremlin voices come and say, "Why don't you?" That's why I don't. Anyway, moving on. Some Russia on fire instance against Sverdlovsk region. This time, an interesting object to a factory of polyethylene pipes is fire. Very interesting. I'm not quite sure why that is so interesting, but Tim White finds that interesting. Thank you, Tim. But that's a problem that still keeps raising its ugly head. And the number of arson attacks on military enlistment officers in Russia has doubled over the past 6 months, according to British intelligence. This may indicate people's distrust of the government's promise not to carry out a new wave of mobilization. You can tell that people are worried about what happens come March the 17th and the presidential election being over, that people will be mobilized, and that is a concern. Right, on to distant strikes. Ukraine has downed all 8 kamikaze drones, the Shahid drones fired by Russia into Ukraine overnight. However, the invaders also launched 1 Iskander-M missile from the Voronezh region and 3 S-300 anti-aircraft missiles against Donetsk. So those are very hard to shoot down. They're not always particularly accurate and sometimes hit. They just fire them into places like Kharkiv, seemingly at civilian infrastructure. They have had some success recently at the Kremenchuk oil site, oil refinery or depot, I'm not sure. But other than that, I don't know the details of those strikes. But as far as drones are concerned, only 8 and all shot down, and just a few ballistic missiles. So again, we're at this stage where the Russians aren't firing missiles. Yes, they're going to be stockpiling them. It's going to be interesting to see how many are sent in the next big wave of Russian missiles. And if it's not, say, a good 100 or so, then we really should be worrying about, well, not worrying, we should be concluding that the Russians aren't producing nearly as much as they need. The Kiev Independent here says explosions were reported last night in Poltava. Air Force reports ballistic missiles, so that's probably concerning those we just heard about. Explosions were heard in the cities of Kremenchuk and Poltava in Poltava Oblast. So Kremenchuk is where the previous oil refinery was hit, and I don't know whether that's been targeted again. Ukraine's Air Force warned 8 p.m. local time threat of enemy ballistic missiles on the way to Kremenchuk, and then explosions were heard. More FAB 250 this time, so the smaller end of that spectrum. Bombs being dropped in Belgorod, though. So 2 of these glide bombs landing inside Russia. It's not the first time this has happened. In fact, it's happened a number of times. Astra says the bombs were discovered in the villages of Postnikov and Streletsko. They say no one was injured and both bombs were defused the next day. But the Russians have form in dropping bombs in their own territory, that's for sure. And with regard to what the Ukrainians have done last night, they attacked the Slavneft Yanos oil refinery in Yaroslav. The drone crashed near the hydrocracking plant. The scene of the incident has been cordoned off. Demining teams arrive. Now, we go and look at what damage wasn't done. Not a lot of damage at all here, but this has been predicted. As talked about yesterday in the extra, the Russians have had a number of their oil infrastructure sites hit by the Ukrainians over the last month. Really, this month the Ukrainians have really stepped up their attacks, going quite some distance with their long-range drones. Now, this one here is some fair distance from Ukraine, up past Moscow by the looks of it there. A drone attacked another oil refinery in Russia, the Slavneft one, 700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Now, although the drone didn't do much damage at all, small fire broke out. The workers put out on their own. There's no information about serious damage. It's claimed the drone was an aircraft type of drone. Looks like that. So, yeah, not a great deal of damage. But Harun, in that video, actually, that I've just referred to, has a little chat about the importance of these attacks. And it's exactly as I've been saying recently about the blanket theory. But actually, there are three elements to the attacks here. So once, as Glasnost Gone here says, Ukraine's tactic of hitting oil and gas terminals and refineries has twofold advantage, I say threefold, and there's a sizable financial implication as they're temporarily shut for repairs. But even better, Putin can't hide the damage and embarrassment of another successful Ukrainian attack, as tens and thousands of workers film and see the damage and then tell hundreds of thousands of their families and friends. As seen below, the Yaroslav refinery is huge and hard to miss. I mean, this is going to be surely targeted again. I mean, that's one small drone landing in the middle of that refinery and not doing any damage. And you might say, well, what's the point of that? But as Glasnost Gone here says, well, okay, so the first issue is first success would be doing lots of damage and shutting down refineries, as we've seen in other places, and that has happened. Okay, second one is PR. This is embarrassing, and indeed we can add to that PR here. So Putin is afraid of being attacked by drones. Because of this, the internet is cut off at night. Temporary 4G mobile internet shutdown at night in Leningrad, Novgorod and Pskov regions is due to adjustments to the equipment of security agencies for anti-drone and air defense, Russian media has reported. This is due to the fact that Putin arrived in St. Petersburg and Ukrainian drones are quietly flying to Russia's Leningrad region. The Russian dictator does not feel safe in his hometown. You've got the PR loss and the embarrassment and the fact that they feel weak, and everyone knows about it, right? As mentioned. But the third one, which is the most important one, is that they then have to get, and this is what Perun talks about, they then have to spread their already thinly spread air defense networks into more and more places. They have to take air defense units from, say, the front line or from some high-value target to put it to another high-value target that then leaves the former one undefended. And that blanket that's too small for the bed is being pulled in different places. Now that Ukraine is saying we can hit, so that one small drone landing in this, where are you? In this oil refinery tells us very clearly that the Ukrainians can hit. Where have you gone? Oh, here it is. Right. That one small drone landing there tells the Russians, we can fire drones here, and we probably will. So what are you going to do about it? And then the Russians really panic because that's a massive oil refinery, and if the Ukrainians send some serious munitions over to that, then they are going to be in trouble. So they then pull an S-400 battery to there, maybe some Strelas. Okay, so some short range and some long range systems there. Okay, brilliant. Where do they come from? Where's now weak? And this is exactly what the Ukrainians want, because Russia is a massive country and they've got resources like these spread out far and wide. And to protect things that are spread out far and wide, you need more and more air defense systems. This is really good for the Ukrainians. Just keep hitting every so often places. Doesn't have to be with huge waves of drones and missiles. The odd drone here, the odd drone there. Keep the Russians on their feet. Get their air defenses spread thinly, and then hit them where it hurts, where you know the air defenses have been pulled from. Explosions in occupied Berdyansk as well yesterday, so that has been targeted. Right, moving on to other bits and pieces here. There's been a DDoS attack, so this is where websites get overwhelmed with like millions of bot attacks, or not attacks, just visiting that website, and then the website can't handle that traffic and just shuts down. And other things can happen as well as part of those attacks. But anyway, DDoS attack on the information resources of coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war. Recorded. These are people that have been trying to deal with whether there were prisoners of war on the cargo plane, the Il-76 that was shot down near Belgorod, which are still absolutely no evidence provided by the Russians, I hasten to add. Apparently, the enemy detected that the information, in particular about the details of the exchange of prisoners of war and the downing of the Il-76, was a threat to Russia. For security reasons, access to some of the functions and resources of the coordination headquarters will be temporarily restricted, but that's a challenge to the Ukrainians there. Ukraine has been very active hacking themselves of late. Defense Ministry inspects enlistment offices, food warehouses, and uncovers many violations. Defense Ministry and law enforcement agencies continue to carry out surprise inspections in regional enlistment offices and food warehouses and have already found many violations, Defense Minister Rustem Umerov wrote on the 28th. According to Umerov, the Defense Ministry aims to fix all the drawbacks systematically and cooperates with the Security Service of Ukraine, the State Bureau of Investigation and Prosecutor General's Office. Right. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. So Ukraine are finding some corruption with procurement of stuff. First thing is, this is not weapons coming from the US, okay? So there's been lots of oversight for that, and there's been absolutely no evidence found of any weapons going awry. Okay, so let's put that to bed. Now, you can see this as bad news, saying, well, they're uncovering corruption. I see this as good news. I mean, it sounds counterintuitive, but if you're finding stuff, yes, it's bad that it's there, but actually there's corruption pretty much everywhere in the world. If you're finding it, it means you're working actively to root it out. And this shows that Ukraine are serious about rooting out corruption. The difference being, I would assume, is that, and this is speculation, that the Russians aren't doing that kind of equivalent themselves, and we're hearing that corruption is rife in the Russian army and with their procurement, and is still an issue. That's what we hear. What are they doing about their own endemic corruption? Because the Ukrainians are working really, really hard to root it out so that they can get accession to the EU, so that they can get accession to NATO, and so that they can get further assistance from partners who are worried about corruption. It sounds like bad news, but actually this isn't just cope as well. This is like good news. Yes, it's bad that it's happening in the first place, but we know it's happening. Everyone knows it's happening. So that news isn't new. But that it's being found out is good news going forward. Right. Reporter Filatov suddenly found out what the Russian army is truly like. This is interesting when stuff like this happens, and we've had now Evil Gherkin being put away for 4 years. He's gone to prison for 4 years for extremism. And what was his crime? Actually, just telling the Russian MOD, telling it like it is. So he was being very realistic about the Russian prospects, about the reality of the Russian losses, about the stupid decisions they're making. Now we have Filatov doing the same, and actually, you hear this a number of times in a number of places. This happens more and more openly. Then this is obviously good for the Ukrainians, but it also shows that the Russians are making crap decisions. There's something I want to say actually. So, where the war is right now, given the second greatest army in the world has invaded Ukraine, and what we've seen over the last 2 years, no matter where the war goes now, no matter where it goes now, the Russians have failed. But this has been an absolutely dismal show of Russian armed forces' capabilities and decision-making strategy. It's been dismal. Right? And there's nothing that can change that. That has happened, it's been and gone. That has happened. We've seen them retreat from Kyiv. We've seen them retreat from Kherson and retreat from Kharkiv as a result of the Ukrainian army doing that to them. And we can see it grind to a stasis where they are unable to affect serious change. And we have seen the loss rates, and we've seen the 58-1 ratio of losses in Krinky for AFVs, and the 18-1 ratio of losses of main battle tanks to the Ukrainians in Krinky. And we've seen the losses in Avdiivka and Vuhledar and Balaklaya on the Seversky Donetsk River, where they lost another 100 vehicles trying to cross the river. But that's happened, and the evidence is there, and it's been and it's gone, and you can't change that. Russia's attack on Ukraine has been insanely embarrassing. Russians should be embarrassed. People in my threads, pro-Kremlin voices in my threads, should be embarrassed about trying to defend that kind of ineptitude. It's pathetic, right? And it's happened. Question is, okay, what does Ukraine do now, and how does it look going forward? And yes, Ukraine have made some bad decisions, and yes, Ukraine have lost some stuff as well. But given that where they started and where they're at now, and given the might of the Russian armed forces, they've done jolly well. And here we have Filatov saying 0 brains, 0 imagination. But the academics have been planning this SMO for they can't even call it a war yet. For 2 years, but never switch their brains on. These geniuses should put their own sons on top of armor. I mean, he's got to a point where he's just like offloaded. Things aren't looking good. There's no evidence that the Russians have done anything approaching a decent job of prosecuting this. Yeah, criticisms on both sides, but man, Russians deserve a heck of a lot more criticism. Right, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care. Speak soon.